Welcome to the fifth and final week of the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies deep dive series into the topic that is on many people's minds these days, Armenia and Azerbaijan at war. I wish I could tell you that beginning next week we'll start a new series called Armenia and Azerbaijan at peace, but I can't. Instead, we've called today's session The Roads to Peace, with the hope that, in fact, we will find those roads and walk on them. The purpose of these conversations with scholars, specialists, analysts, journalists, has been to try to explain all of the complexities, to try to understand the many, many facets of this conflict that is really seen as existential and destiny-making on all sides, where geography and security and identity and history are all tangled up together for everyone. That was complex enough, and now that the sides continue to negotiate and consistently don't come to a conclusion, that simply drives home the complexity of this, which now has become even more difficult with the involvement of Turkey. Turkey, which has its own expansionist interests, its need for geopolitical legitimacy, and its interests in the Caucasus neighborhood, as well as, of course, its alliance with Azerbaijan. That now makes the road to peace complicated. Of course, Russia's presence is always both a complication and also a source of hope for Armenians, because there is a security alliance between Russia and Armenia. So all of these complexities, on top of the fact that there's now a war to reckon with and to win, something that all sides want. So the road to peace will now be harder to find, and our job here is to understand the calculus that is involved in all of their bilateral relationships, Turkey, Russia, with each other, with others in the region, and to understand that their honor, their international standing, their place as hegemons, their place as inheritors of empire, their national interests and their bilateral interests, that all of these are now factors in this search for peace. In other words, in some ways, this now is destiny making for them as well as for the sides. Like it wasn't complicated enough, right? So let's start. At the very beginning of this series, the very first week, our man on the ground was Robert Avedisian, who is Karabakh's permanent representative to Washington, D.C. And at that time, Robert was in a bunker in Stepanakert. Today, he's in Washington. He's returned, I would imagine, to talk to all of everybody else who's in a bunker in Washington these days, and trying to bring some realization of the huge consequences, potential consequences of this conflict for the United States as well. Robert, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with what you can tell us about the situation on the ground.
If you allow, I will start by thanking you and your entire team in the USC for showing this consistent attention to the development in and around Artsakh. And I'm honored to be a participant of the first and of the last session. And as you rightfully mentioned, it was our hope that the situation will not go as long and as bad as it is. Unfortunately, we don't have any good news from the battlefield. Turks, I'm saying Turks in the first place because entire Azerbaijan has been swallowed by Turkey now, and the entire command and control is in the Turkish hands. Turks and Azerbaijanis and terrorists continue their attacks on all fronts. They have penetrated into various settlements around Artsakh. The large army attacks kind of stopped, but it doesn't mean that the situation is going to cool down anyhow. It's not good. They continue to disregard the calls of the international community. The attempts in Moscow, then in Paris, then in Washington, D.C. didn't bring to anything. And we just have to rely on our forces to bring them to peace.
The contradiction in that sentence, I suppose, is obvious to anyone who heard it. The humanitarian ceasefire, as it was called, what did that mean and what did that do?
That meant to take a pause to the extent possible to make sure that the parties, which considering the very intense course of hostilities, can remove the bodies from the front line, because there is a great number of bodies which have been killed in action and they have to be retreated for various reasons. Humanitarian reasons is very important. Also, the sanitary situation is also going to deteriorate. The ecological situation is deteriorating with all this. But unfortunately, Azerbaijan said no even to that. And that could have been a slightest, probably the most logical confidence building, very minor confidence building measure between the parties, but it's not going anywhere. They continue to fight. They reject all the attempts to cease the fire and to give this inhuman war a humanitarian something, at least something which resembles human relations.
The permanent question in my mind is, how do you get from this kind of violence to the environment necessary to talk about peace, which I imagine is peace, not simply demilitarization? What can be expected of these populations that are living this kind of violence?
Tough question, of course. Tough question because there is always one of the outcomes is always the victory of one of the sides, right? Then the talks begin, but from different perspectives and from different positions in terms of force on the negotiations. If we start from now, I think that the best format was developed with the participation of the OSCE Minsk group. They've suggested to take a pause for humanitarian reasons. Maybe something else could have been done during that pause. And one item on the document was that the rest of the peace enforcement measures were supposed to be discussed then. Didn't happen, and there is no any mechanism, which was also the idea of the negotiators, to install the mechanism of control of the ceasefire regime, and Azerbaijan said no to that too.
The mechanism of control of the ceasefire regime. That means to monitor it?
To monitor and to demonstrate and to indicate which party has violated the ceasefire. And Azeri said no to that. In parallel with that's another indication who started this and who really wants to continue the war. And this is not the war as they try to present for this is nothing else than a genocidal attempt again, and they're trying to just finish the deal, as Erdogan said, the mission of their forefathers in the South Caucasus.
Robert, if we're going to talk about peace, and if that means negotiations require an agenda, and if the agenda is the obvious, seemingly obvious, unless there are others, basic fundamental four elements, four fundamental obstacles that need to be dealt with. There is obviously the issue of the status of Karabakh, its political status. There's obviously the issue of security. There's the issue of the refugees, 300,000 Armenian refugees, 700,000 Azerbaijani refugees from 30 years ago. And there's the issue of the territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. Are those the four fundamental issues on the table? Is that fair?
So, Bijan, territories and refugees, they are the consequence of this conflict, and that was not the choice of Karabakh or the Armenian side, per se. Those are the consequences. The reason was probably the most important thing is the security and the status as the most important component of the security notion for Artsakh. Those are very important, and we never say that we're not ready to discuss however politically charged or heavy any issue can be, but it doesn't mean that they have to demand capitulation from Artsakh. It's not going to happen, and we're paying a very high price, but we're forced too often in this world and in this reality to prove that we deserve to live in the freedom and government of our choosing and in our home. And we think that there is a whole set of things the world can do to cool down the situation. And to return to your previous question, how we can get to the peace now, just to implement what their foreign minister has signed 3 times, to return to implementation of commitments, to try to cool down Turkey's aspiration, because no matter what Azerbaijan even tries to do, Turkey is there to say no and to push forward. We have to make sure that this issue is not a domestic political issue for Azerbaijan, because the more they dig themselves into this problem, the more they connect themselves with all the means of reaching their goal, the more heavy this hits on the political situation in Azerbaijan. They even went as far as connecting themselves with the international terrorism to reach their goal. And sanctions are very, very important. If clearly one of the sides has rejected suggestion of all the 3 major co-chairs of the OSCE, which also are 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, of course it has to lead to sanctions. There is a sanction, it can be the example of Magnitsky sanctions, personally against Azerbaijani officials. It can be trade sanctions, political sanctions.
What does that give us?
They have to feel responsibility for every action they do.
What would sanctions give us? How would sanctions make the road to peace more possible?
Sanctions would help constrain Turkish aspirations in the region and in Azerbaijan in particular. Sanctions would target Azerbaijan and make it painful, because apparently money and personal welfare is a big chunk of their concern, and they're doing whatever they can to preserve that wealth. Sanctions will demonstrate the pattern of behavior by the international structure, that any action, just like we said during the first weeks of it, and that any action, there is an irreversibility of responsibility for every action you take. Good will bring positive, bad will lead to negative things which will hit you personally, which will hit your family's interests, be it in your own country or elsewhere, which will help us all, Armenians and the rest of the world, to fight against what is becoming a hotbed of terrorism in Azerbaijan.
Is it possible to say that for Karabakh, for the people of Artsakh, that security is the first concern, and that status, the political status that theoretically is the guarantor of long-term security, is the second concern, and that the other 2, what you called the consequences of the first war, the territories that have come under Armenian control around Karabakh and refugees, those are consequences and can be addressed? Is that a fair summation of what you said?
We've never said that there is no any issue that we are staying away from discussing. We always said that the issue of refugees is a bilateral issue, just like you said, hundreds of thousands of Armenian issues. They also have rights and expectations, and if everything is done towards the refugees, everybody, every segment of the refugee component should be addressed. The same is for the territories. We have Shahumyan, we have Martuni, we have Martakert, and now they're actually expanding their military presence in all over, not only the Artsakh, but also the Soviet time areas too. I mean, they've already gone too far. Yeah, I would say that, I would reiterate that the status and security are the 2 intertwined components. That's why we say that the recognition of the Republic of Artsakh will finalize this deal, and not only it will give us the tool set of political measures, also political leverages to negotiate with Azerbaijan and with the rest of the world towards securing the situation in the region. It will also take this utopia from Azerbaijani leaders who think that if the world hasn't recognized Artsakh, it means that they can try to conquer and they will digest it politically. And I want to also address one misunderstanding that we have seen among many specialists who are dealing with this conflict. They think that the recognition of Artsakh will derail the negotiation process. Is absolutely the opposite. The recognition of the Republic of Artsakh will help to put this process into political field, because the negotiations are not around the status of Artsakh, they are around the peaceful resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict with Azerbaijan. And that implies that self-determination, recognition of the results of self-determination of Artsakh should be taken into account as a means to prevent what we're seeing now, to cool down the situation now, to tell Aliyev that you have to deal with this. that Artsakh sovereignty is a fact and it should be considered, and it will take away most of his reasons to resort to force anytime soon or anytime in the future.
I hope you stay on, because as we continue this conversation today, that issue of recognition and whether it in fact brings us security is one of the things we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about remedial secession. We'll be talking about accountability for war crimes. And at the end of the day, my question always is, but if there's not a power base that goes with it, how do those international declarations really give us peace? But for now, I just want to say thank you for your patience for explaining Karabakh's position to us one more time. Thank you, and I hope the next time we speak, we can be talking about negotiations and the road to peace.
Thank you, Reza. I will hope to. And also, if you don't mind, I would suggest talking about the remedial recognition. Remedial cessation has taken place 30 years ago, but it leads to what we're seeing now. Let's talk about recognition of the sovereignty as a remedy for our people who is undergoing all these hardships. Thank you, Salpi, and thank you all the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for the observation. Thank you very much. We are going to now move on to the remainder of this last program, this last session. And we're going to talk about not just the military war on the ground, but also the information war. After that, we will be talking about the OSCE Minsk process with a former OSCE Minsk group co-chair. And finally, we will be speaking with two scholars, practitioners, who in fact work in the field of international justice, war crimes, remedial secession, international law at the end of the day. So let's move on to the second segment. And as always, those of you who followed this series know that my colleague Emil Sanamyan is with us in these conversations. Emil edits the Focus on Karabakh section of the Institute's website. And he writes on politics and security in the Caucasus and the wider neighborhood. Together with Emil, we'll be speaking with Samvel Mardirosyan, who is known as an information security analyst and is also involved in cybersecurity matters, and these days, and not just these days, follows social media and the information war closely to see how it parallels with, how it echoes that which is happening on the ground. So Emil, welcome back, and Samvel, welcome.
Hi.
Samvel, I have possibly a naive question. I understand from the military specialists, and Emil, this is really my only question to Samvel, and then it's all you. My fundamental naive question is this, that military wars, the wars on the ground, have rules, such as they are. They have leaders, they follow a determined strategy, there is a hierarchy. This information war that is so hot, so violent, so hate-filled, so seemingly hopeless, is this an organized war? What happens when, hopefully when the other war slows down and other paths are pursued? What happens to this information war?
This information is not just started on September 27. Armenia and Azerbaijan is on information war from the beginning of the first Karabakh war. Of course, it's changed, and in 2000s it's turned to the cyber battleground, and now we have situation for years that we have ongoing information war, and now I will say that it is not just an information war how it was before, when, for example, some propaganda guys telling via radio some manipulation things, etc. We have something that a lot of people called hybrid war, when information warfare, cyber warfare, and military, real military, what is going on background, it has become a big mixture. Of course, it is coordinated. And of course, we can see how a lot of things are mixed with each other. For example, hackers hacking social media accounts, and then these accounts are used by some intelligence guys or some other. Of course, we cannot recognize who is behind the monitor, but these hacked accounts starting to spread, for example, misinformation or something to spread panic among people living in Karabakh, etc., to help to continue military operation, etc. So we have situation when some guys are operating on the ground, and another guys are helping them via social media, via attacks on cyberspace, and sometimes you don't understand who is where, because a lot of fake accounts, a lot of Azeris using Armenian fake accounts, a lot of Armenians using Azeri fake accounts, and this is a big mess, of course.
But there's also the genuine outpouring, right? On all sides. I mean, people who were the quieter, more conciliatory ones. I mean, Emil, this change that we're seeing in social media, in this, I don't know if that is part of the information war or if that is simply social media echoing the information war and the military war.
Well, I mean, there are many layers here of information war. Basically, any expression online can be construed as an information war because war is underway and people are dying and everything's perceived through those actions on the ground and the little video and reporting that we get from the ground. What I would like to ask Samuel is how do you read the main messages from Azerbaijan, from the official Azerbaijan, and also sort of the affiliated entities towards Armenians, and how do you read messages from the Armenian side towards Azerbaijan? What is the main message that each side is sending to the other, in your thinking?
I think first of all, both sides at the moment even do not sending direct messages because there is a big wall between each other. They are using like proxies. What is coming via these social media proxies or using media of third part, for example, of another countries, etc. We can see that all Armenian social media flooded by terrible videos and photos, which I am pretty sure coordinatedly spreading and via comments, people getting these messages via messengers, WhatsApp, Viber, etc. Azeris sending died Armenian soldiers' corpse, terrible videos, etc. They just trying to spread some depression and panic among Armenian population. That's the main message which is coming, and as I told, I'm sure that it is coordinated by the state, because it is enormous amount of information coming via direct messages to the Armenians. Another is to show that Armenian already lost the war. This is to two main messages. What is trying to do Armenian state, let's say? It's one thing is try to show that Azeris never will win. Another trying to push national minorities in Azerbaijan to somehow to trying to divide Azerbaijani society. I think at the moment this is the main messages which both sides trying to spread using some specific methods, because in Azerbaijan, you know, almost all social media is blocked, and in Armenia, almost all Azerbaijani media sites are blocked. So each side had to use some proxy ways to get the society of the opposite side.
I wanted to push back on this one issue that you mentioned, is that you believe that the videos, gruesome videos that are being spread around, are coordinated by the government or the regime of Aliyev. If we look back at 2016, when some of the similar things happened on a smaller scale, there was a lot of claims, denials from Azerbaijani government, and that they were, you know, that this is credible videos or legitimate videos, trying to distance themselves from those kinds of actions. And it seemed to me that part of the reason that they actually imposed this block on the social media in this time around was to limit the amount of war crimes documentation that will come out of Azerbaijan, because this is sort of the MO of Azerbaijani forces. Whenever they either capture Armenian civilians or come across the bodies of Armenian soldiers, is to, you know, to basically cause as much damage to both living and the dead, and make a video reporting of it and sort of gloat about it. Did you see that in part as part of the reason why the social media was blocked in Azerbaijan? How do you generally evaluate this decision that they took to block all of the social media compared to Armenian decision not to interfere with social media?
I'm not sure that they blocked not to have some leaked information, because I can say that they, of course, they are not trying to spread videos which are containing war crimes like beheadings or cutting ears of dead soldiers, etc. But they are spreading a lot of videos just with the corpse of soldiers, etc. And they just an example, enormous amount of money and spreading these videos via Facebook advertisement, for example. So Armenians targeted on Facebook just to get these videos and photos via. So their government is paying, Azerbaijani government paying to Facebook to show this via advertisement. Why they blocked social media? I think more to block information about own losses, and we can see that how they blocked all information. So they are not publishing names of fallen soldiers, just only if it is some
commander or military leader, yeah.
Yeah. So I think they trying to block information in general. They trying to control situation inside the Azerbaijani society to have more controlled situation inside, but not to block some leaks, because almost every day we can find leaks of videos with war crimes. So I think they even do not work to to stop it, because it's enormous amount of videos where they are beheading soldiers, cutting ears, and I really don't understand how they got so many sick people in the army, but that's fact. And what is interesting in this time, almost everything is spreading via Telegram channels. Why? I think because, first of all, Telegram is almost impossible to block. We have seen it the same in Belarus, when Lukashenko blocked almost everything in internet, but Telegram still works because it has inside some specific tools to somehow going through blocking. And the second is Telegram is not censoring content like Facebook. On Facebook, you will be blocked if you will post some really tough videos.
So what we have, what you're both saying is what we have managed, or more managed or less managed, is the most extreme expressions of the violence that this war is causing, and at the same time, the non-organized social media participation on all sides again continues to call on the most maximalist of positions. And so I'm just going to ask the question again. I don't expect an answer because we have to move on, and that is, how does that get reined in when the time comes to talk about reining in the maximalism and actually moving on to solutions? So as I said, I don't expect an answer because we've got to move on, but I think that the managed part possibly is easier than the non-managed part of this challenge. In any case, Samuel Mardirosyan, thank you for helping us better understand the complexities of that aspect of this war. Emil and I will continue now to speak with, but before we bring him in, to speak with Stephen Mann, who was a co-chair of the Minsk Group, a U.S. co-chair of the Minsk Group. But before that, Emil, I'm going to try to do this, and please interrupt and add and subtract. I'm going to try to very briefly explain the OSCE raison d'etre in this whole situation and what is expected of these poor OSCE Minsk co-chairs, and I say that quite genuinely. So the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe was established in the 70s in order to create a forum for conversation between that part of Europe that was within the Warsaw Pact and the rest of Europe. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, very quickly, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe became the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in Budapest, at the summit where that was decided, what they said in their first press release was, in one of its biggest new challenges, the CSCE was authorized with an appropriate UN Security Council resolution to send a multinational peacekeeping force to Nagorno-Karabakh following agreement among the parties for cessation of the armed conflict. And they created the group that would continue to work for the creation of conditions in which such a peace conference might take place. And that group was called the Minsk Group because that's where this conference was going to take place. The group's permanent members, and we rarely talk about this, the group's permanent members are Belarus, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Finland, and Turkey, as well as Armenia and Azerbaijan. But also members of this Minsk group are the troika of the OSCE, the current chairman of the OSCE, the last and the next. And these days, that's Albania, Slovakia, and Finland again. And in order for this complicated body to actually be able to function, there are 3 co-chairs of this Minsk group, representing Russia, the United States, and France. Stephen Mann was the American diplomat for 3 decades before he left the State Department and joined ExxonMobil Corporation's International Government Relations Group in 2009. And during his years in the State Department, he held several positions in the former Soviet Union and South Asia and maintained a focus on energy diplomacy. He was the one who opened the U.S. Embassy in Armenia, and in the mid-2000s, Ambassador Stephen Mann was the U.S. co-chair of the Minsk Group. Ambassador Mann, Steve, thank you for joining us. You are now retired, both from foreign service and from the private sector, you lucky guy. So I hope we can talk about some of the difficult questions involved in the negotiations. And I just want to say at the outset that from where I've sat all these years, the advantage of the Minsk Group has been that the co-chairs did not try to impose a solution. Of course, for that, they are often hung, including most recently by President Aliyev, for not doing their job and not coming to a resolution. So, Ambassador Mann, why didn't you do your job, and why didn't you bring us to a resolution?
Well, thanks. What an intro, Salpi. Thank you so much.
Well, I wanted to really get the OSCE Minsk Group facts down. Emil, did I leave anything out?
We could talk at length, but I'll let Steve talk.
Well, we heard this repeatedly in all of our visits in Baku, Yerevan, and Stepanakert. Why hasn't the Minsk Group brought a solution? And our answer, in the years that I was doing this, our answer was the same, which is we're mediators, not arbitrators. If you want us to arbitrate a solution, we will give you a solution. We can do that. But the mandate we have, as you've referred here, the 1995 mandate is to promote dialogue, promote negotiations. And in the years that I did that, that I was part of this group, I just have nothing but admiration for my fellow co-chairs of France and Russia, and also, Salpi, for you and the Armenian side, and for the Azerbaijani negotiators. It was some of the pure gold of diplomacy in those meetings. The problem is, it is an extraordinarily difficult issue with a humanitarian tragedy overlaid upon that, and that is why we've been in this situation for 30 years.
Steve, I think it's important for listeners, viewers to understand how diplomacy works in a situation that is A, this complex, and B, really mostly irrelevant to most of the other global goings-on. Can you either speak about specific instances or, one of the threads and how that gets developed so that not just in order to understand the Minsk process up to this point, but to kind of understand why negotiations going forward are just not going to be easy?
Well, yeah.
If I could supplement
one.
Emil, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I could supplement that question and go a little bit of background. The OSC CSC track, originally championed by Jack Maresca, was kind of an alternate track to Russia only or Russia-led effort, right? So there was a period when, according to Ambassador Kazimierov, that Russia wanted to impose a solution, and there was resistance from the United States via the CSC towards that. Do you think that resistance is still there? Do you think if Russia would try to impose a solution today, there would be any kind of negative repercussions from the West? I mean,
just a quick response to that. My speculation is yes, because the West is invested in the OSCE process, believes in it, and does not believe that Russia has special rights over its former republics in some. But Salpi, back to the thrust of your comments. A key thing that my predecessors and successors did as part of the Minsk Group is we legitimate dialogue. We provide a forum for this dialogue to take place. If you don't have that, you are not going to see an Armenian foreign minister reaching out to Baku or vice versa. You lay yourself open to charges of adventurism. It just becomes a harder thing to do. I'm not saying that that either side wouldn't do it.
Okay, so it's a
But
forum.
then you have to have a Nixon in China kind of moment. So we create that space to have the dialogue. And then in the Prague process, as you perfectly know, the idea of the Prague process was a non-attributable private forum to bat around and argue through the different parameters of the issues. And out of that became the set of principles that eventually coalesced in the 2009 Basic Principles document.
So let's talk about that in a minute, but I want to add to Emil's question about the pushback that Russia might get. How does the situation change now with Turkey wanting very adamantly to be part of the negotiation process, part of the mediating team? Does it change?
Yeah, I'm not. We had this come up at different points when I was co-chair. It's an issue that always comes up. Why don't we add Turkey? Why don't we add other countries? Speaking simply as a practical diplomat, I don't see how that advances a negotiation process. Cannot see how it does it. The issue always has been political will. The basic parameters of an agreement have been out there for the longest time. And you've enumerated the basic parameters. They're not easy. The devil really is in the details. And I would also say that a peacekeeping force is far more difficult than most people think. And I'm not talking, let us say, about the unilateral dispatch of Russian peacekeepers or some variation like that. But if you are looking for, say, a Sarajevo-like group of international peacekeepers, that's extraordinarily expensive. And we looked at that back in 2005. We worked with the military committee on that to say, okay, bring us up to speed, cost this out. How could this, what would a PKF look like? And it's certainly feasible, but it takes a lot of investment from donor nations to do it.
Yeah, and these days there's neither the will nor the money to try to do that. So at the risk of alienating a whole lot of people, both of you, Emil and Steve, can we list off some of the crazy, maybe negotiating directions that have been or might be considered in order to move this forward? This assumes, of course, that everybody demonstrates political will and trust in each other. Now, I don't know if, having said trust, whether this conversation is just not to be had these days, because there is there's not a modicum of trust on anybody's side. So perhaps this is a pointless conversation. But let me say the obvious. That is, if this could have been solved by a simple Karabakh is Armenian and back off, or Karabakh is Azerbaijani and back off, it would have been solved. Guess what? It hasn't been. And now there's a war that basically is saying the same thing, right? One side is saying this is Armenian.
It's different now. It's different now. We have involvement by Turkey to the extent we never had before. We have direct presence by Turkish Air Force, by Turkish mercenaries, etc. So that has changed the balance of things on the ground, and that is, in a way, bringing about an imposed resolution by Turkey. So Stephen mentioned that bringing Turkey into the format may not have been useful when it was a sort of fragile situation in terms of discussions, in terms of working out overlapping positions and working negotiated solution. Today, now that Turkey is actually involved in the fighting directly, it would seem any measure, including bringing Turkey into the negotiations format to mitigate its extent of its participation, might be useful. And going back to sort of Russia-centric solutions, we've, of course, back in the early 90s, there was a big reluctance by Armenian side and by Azerbaijani side to have Russians again run things around there, because prior to that we had a Soviet-Russian peacekeeping force back in the late 80s, early 90s that didn't satisfy either side. But today, considering the distance that there's been, from the EU and from the United States in terms of this conflict, it seems like the only approach, the only possibility of tampering down tensions and the bloodletting that's ongoing, and considering the extent we had from the American current Trump administration. The claim that there might be a Scandinavian peacekeeping mission, and turns out the Scandinavians weren't even approached about this. We don't see seriousness on the part of the West. So that's kind of where things are at this moment. Might be a political transition might be coming soon, but I don't think it's going to be soon enough for this conflict.
Let me just clarify. Also, I'm not saying that Turkey should not be included in a negotiation, but as a co-chair, I think it's a non-starter. And Salpi, let me just sort of summarize here by saying points that we, the co-chairs, made back then, and I think they're still in operation now. One is, to the Azerbaijani side, our message was there is no stable military solution to this conflict. Now that sounds platitudinous, but if you look around the world at where there have been lively conflicts, you look at Kashmir, that is still going on 70 years later. For the Armenian side, our message was time is not on your side. It is, your position is not going to get better as the years and the decades go past. And I think that's being borne out. And for each side, and this is the difficult part, we said, we know of no negotiation where one side has gotten all of its demands. So therefore, you, the Aliyev administration, you, the Kocharyan administration, need to start thinking about what you put on the table for compromises. But then, if each side does that, they open themselves up to domestic political attack. And that is what has added to the difficulty of this.
I guess I'm going to try to move on, because I want to talk about what many people's fallback position seems to be, and that is international law and justice and human rights violations almost a sense of legal international entitlement as a result of violence or a history of mistreatment by a government. So I'm feeling really guilty about moving on. That's why I'm iming and humming. But Steve Mann, thank you very much. Emil, do you want to ask a final question?
I want to add a point here as far as the time is not in the favor of Armenians, that kind of argument. Certainly, the balance of power between Turkey and Armenia will indefinitely remain unfavorable as far as Armenia is concerned. So the only difference between today and 30 years ago is not that Turkey has gotten that much stronger than Armenia. It was always much stronger. But the Turkish involvement is no longer deterred by either West or the Russians at this point. So that's that argument, I think, was somewhat not completely clear as to what it is, where the balance of forces is unhinged. And in terms of sort of Western role in this whole situation, certainly, Ambassador Mann was involved in energy diplomacy, etc. I mean, pumping in American money into making this energy infrastructure, making it possible for Azerbaijan to rearm, etc. That was also part of this process that was essentially delinked from the conflict and made it possible for Azerbaijan to rearm with very few limitations in terms of the type of weapons they could buy and the type of weapons they can now deploy.
Since we're there, Steve, can I ask you a question? We're clearly not moving on right
Sure.
away. As far as oil goes, the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline and all of the machinations that went into making sure that would happen, but also instead of going the obvious route and including Armenia, not including Armenia for obvious Azerbaijan veto reasons. But was there room there for that decision to be different so that Armenia and Azerbaijan would somehow have to have been codependent?
Yeah, that was a commercial question, and this was raised a number of times before the pipeline construction started. Simple point is, the lenders were not going to lend money if it's going through two states with hostile relations when you can run around. 70% of the, $2.3 billion cost was given by lenders. And it wouldn't have been a financeable project.
Nevertheless, and in any case, we are where we are. We do have a Turkey hugely involved and Azerbaijan hugely armed. And
let me just say, Salpi, the dangers in this situation exist for Azerbaijan as well as Armenia. And I would not minimize that this is a dangerous situation for both countries. If there could be a spread of the fighting, it is not a situation that Baku or Yerevan should want to be in.
Well, I'm into that. Thank you, Ambassador Steve Mann. We're going to move on to the last segment of today's program, which in many ways for me is at the core of this discussion about the road to peace. And that is accountability, remediation, the concept of remedial secession, the fact that all of this began with a call to self-determination, and what does that really mean if you don't have the power to back that up? And what does accountability mean now in the middle of, at the end of, I don't know where we are, a new war with new violence and all sorts of new reasons to distrust each other. And we have two guests, two individuals who have been professionally engaged in these very issues for quite a while. Professor Milena Stereo is professor of law at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law in Ohio. She is also co-coordinator for Global Justice Partnerships at the Public International Law and Policy Group. Her work is in the field of international law, international criminal law, international human rights, the law of the seas, and in particular maritime piracy. We're here today not to talk about the law of the seas, alas, I wish we were, but about international law as it pertains to self-determination, and to a specific angle on self-determination called remedial secession, something that Armenia's prime minister has referred to often as both goal and justification. Our other guest is Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who from 2009 to 2015 served as the U.S. Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues, heading the Office of Global Criminal Justice in the U.S. State Department. Global Criminal Justice, it sounds good. Prior to that appointment, this international criminal lawyer was prosecutor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and earlier chief of prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So he has had his fair share of trying to bring justice to peoples who have suffered atrocities in wartime, and crimes committed in war will be brought to justice is something that we hear, we say. Ambassador Rapp, thank you for joining us, and tell us, is there a mechanism for accountability, for whatever justice means, that can lead to whatever peace might mean?
Well, the relationship between justice and peace exists and is extremely important. Do keep in mind, you talk about remedial secession and those kinds of issues, and we've dealt with that in other places, and extremely difficult to litigate and to work out. Obviously, Kosovo is probably the closest example, and that still remains controversial in terms of international, the ICJ made an advisory opinion, but many countries still don't recognize Kosovar independence. So whether there's a resolution there, perhaps Professor Stereo could talk about it. My concern are the tragic things that happen when you do have conflict, and particularly where there's an ethnic and a sectarian aspect to it. Where there are people on both sides that feel profoundly aggrieved, and when they suffer in particular ways, they're inclined to escalate and to take it out on others, and that's the situation that then often creates horrendous crimes that make it even more difficult to reconcile. And of course, the situations I've dealt with are prosecuting those that are responsible. Now, we're fortunately not yet into that area, though of course people, we do have indiscriminate shelling, which is a violation of the laws of war, happened on both sides. We've had these situations documented of prisoners being killed, including this one incident that was videoed, and those are serious things, and of course there's documentation that will take place on all of that. Now, where there'll be justice for it is still challenging. I mean, I myself I was in Chushi last year and visited actually the conflict zone and saw the development in that area and the positive signs, but then went over on the other side and people were aggrieved and wanted to get back to their territory, et cetera. And where things have really gotten bad in some situations is when you begin to have what often we call ethnic cleansing, which people don't want to leave a particular area, and so there's a targeted violence, not necessarily to kill everybody, but to make life intolerable. And so you have killings and other acts of brutality and burning, et cetera, in order to drive people off and move your own population eventually into those areas. And that's why the conflict in the former Yugoslavia became so brutal. And that, in fact, was the strategy of various sides, and the leaders on those sides ended up being prosecuted for it. Yeah.
So there's the word that you used, strategy. And so, Emil, jump in if you'd like. The strategy from the Azerbaijani side seems to clearly be ethnic cleansing, because Otherwise, I don't understand how one would explain that this is a government that wants to take these citizens back as its own citizens after this kind of violent relationship. And Milena, Professor Stereotet, let's talk about whether there is a true remedial space in this. I think that from the Armenian perspective, we have come to a place where, if it's really, really, really bad ethnic cleansing, we're starting to call it genocide because we think that that's a quantity term and not something else entirely. And then from the perspective of the victims, we've come to a point that, if we have been victimized this long and this badly, then the international community somehow owes us some sort of remediation in the form possibly of allowing secession. So there, I put the whole world before you.
Yeah, if I could add to what Salpi just asked, what are the necessary minimum ingredients for leaders of countries engaged in war crime conduct to be held responsible? So, we could think of a leader of Kosovo who was just charged, and we could think of a former leader of Serbia was charged previously. And another question is, what are the basic ingredients for remedial secession to come about and be recognized and to give international support, as was the case again with Kosovo?
If we can go back to Stephen Rapp on part of this and then go to Milena, but Stephen, part of the problem with this question, as we had discussed with Nick Kumjian 2 weeks ago, I think, last week, I don't remember anymore, is that Armenia and Azerbaijan don't have standing in these international forums, International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. So who holds who accountable and how?
Well, and it could be a situation where crimes could be committed and immediate justice wouldn't take place. If both countries were in the ICC, Georgia, by the way, is in the ICC, and that's created a situation where the Russian-Georgian conflict in South Ossetia in 2008 is actually a formal investigation right now in terms of crimes on one side or the other that occurred on the territory of Georgia. We don't have that possibility here.
In fact, both Armenia and Azerbaijan clearly said at the time that this is why they wouldn't join.
Create a court later. Now, obviously, if you commit crimes on the territory of a state that's joined the ICC, you can end up being pulled into it. That's controversial. That's happened with the U.S. It's happening with potentially with Israel. It's happening, obviously, with Russia in the context of Georgia and perhaps with Ukraine. So, it's possible, but neither of these countries are in the ICC. So it doesn't go there. And even if it did, the case would have to reach a certain level of gravity before the ICC would be involved. Of course, gravity is in the eye of the beholder, but, we've had cases in which I prosecuted the Rwanda genocide with 800,000 people murdered in 100 days. That was a one-off special tribunal, but usually the ICC has gotten involved in cases, at least like Kenya, where 1,200 were murdered and 600,000 were displaced, or Cote d'Ivoire, where 3,000 were killed, though in many other situations, it's many thousands more than that. And so many times these cases don't get to an international court. Then you've got the possibility that there could be prosecutions by a third country. If one of the perpetrators could show up in a third country that's active in this area, and they could begin to investigate, like we have Syrian alleged torturers on trial in Germany right now. And they might not have to be high-level individuals to be prosecuted. On the other hand, states don't prosecute the heads of states, the heads of, or the leaders of other states under international law. So usually there's a lower-level individual. So there are ways that justice eventually can come in these situations. And because of that, people are now, in every conflict, including this one, spending a lot of effort documenting them. And frankly, though we don't want anybody taking risks, documenting at the time and knowing as much as possible about what really happened, because there's always a lot of false claims.
So it's really a parallel process.
You need to have that. if we're going to have justice eventually.
So really, this is a parallel process to the political process. This isn't something that happens that serves to deal with the levels of distrust, mistrust in order to go to some process of self-determination. Milena, please step in.
Sure. So, and by the way, thank you so much for inviting me. This is
Please.
truly a wonderful forum. So on the issue of remedial secession, this is a very difficult area in international law. International law recognizes the principle of self-determination for all peoples. And while everybody agrees that this is a principle of international law, it applies to all peoples, there is uncertainty in two main areas. One is this question of self-determination outside of the decolonization paradigm, because self-determination truly arose as the main vehicle for, the theoretical underpinning for decolonization. What you have here in Nagorno-Karabakh is not a colonial context. You could sort of argue that the Soviet Union was sort of like a pseudo-colonial empire, right? But it's not truly a decolonization context. So that's one difficulty. The other difficulty is that even though most would agree that self-determination applies outside of the decolonization context, most would say it does, but it ought to be exercised within the framework of the mother state. That basically peoples ought to be able to exercise self-determination internally through a form of autonomy from the mother state. Now, we do have scholars, and we do have the Quebec opinion from the Canadian Supreme Court that suggests that in extreme instances of oppression, a people outside of the decolonization context ought to be able to exercise the right to self-determination externally through so-called remedial secession.
That's where the remediation comes in. You are being remediated
exactly. Now,
for some horrid suffering.
Yes, but exactly. But because international law also recognizes, for example, the principle of territorial integrity of existing states, I think you and everybody else can understand why recognizing the legality of external self-determination through remedial secession is such a difficult proposition, because it does threaten the existing territorial integrity of states. And international law's primary subjects are states, and international law is truly, sort of primarily concerned with preserving the existing order and preserving the status quo of territorial borders. So secession, remedial secessions without the consent of the mother state are just a very difficult proposition for international law. I'm not saying impossible, but very difficult.
But
yet we have the precedents, right, that I mentioned, the Kosovo precedent, and also we have precedent in South Ossetia, where at one point Russia claimed there was an attempted genocide, and as a result they recognized the independence of both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So if we could maybe go back to the question I asked, what are the basic ingredients of this? I mean, it seems to me the main basic ingredient is to have a major power such as Russia or the United States decide that that's the best outcome to pursue a remedial solution, or pursue war crimes tribunal. Is that the case, really? I mean, do you have to have that kind of champion? That's how the system works?
Well, I mean, legally speaking, I don't think anybody would agree that if we're constructing a legal framework on secession, I don't think that anybody would say, ingredient number one is support by the US or support by Russia. But realistically speaking, how this plays out, it is true that oftentimes a secessionist movement does need to have the support of a major power. And for example, you cite Kosovo, the United States has been a major supporter of Kosovo. So in reality, I would agree that it is true that support by one of the major powers is, I say required, but is definitely a positive. And then you mentioned some of these cases. I would say that Kosovo is probably the closest case, in the sense that you have a territory that de jure belongs to one state, but is predominantly ethnically inhabited by another group, right? There's a history of oppression, and the majority group in this territory wishes to separate. So I think, factually speaking, I think Kosovo is probably the closest case.
The question of the power support, does that apply to accountability issues as well, Stephen Rapp? The accountability.
I do keep in mind in the past when we've had tribunals established, like for the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda, they've gone through the Security Council, and that meant that none of the major powers objected or vetoed them. And if the ICC is now sent into a situation where there is not a state party, that also requires an action by the Security Council, which happened on Sudan and happened on Libya, but then was blocked on Syria. And I would think it's quite likely that if there were a referral here, you'd have a state, particularly Russia, who could say precisely, potentially blocking the involvement of the ICC in this area. So I don't think we're likely to see that. And as I say, you'd have to have more than one. Now, obviously, from a political reality standpoint, having a major state supporting you makes it possible to have the sort of de facto become the permanent, but doesn't get you past your legal issue. And of course, in the case of Kosovo, what happened there was a majority of we voted the security of the General Assembly of the UN to ask for an advisory opinion on Kosovo independence, which the International Court of Justice rendered in Kosovo's favor, but it wasn't binding, and obviously isn't followed by a lot of others.
So, if we go back to the colonial
the crimes that could be happening, though sometimes if horrible crimes happen, that increases this sort of level of oppression that Professor Stereo was talking about, that was part of the circumstances in Kosovo that made that kind of the exceptional case in which there's separation without consent.
So separation without consent versus separation with consent. So is it fair to say that over these 20-something years, no, let's just go forward from where we are today. If, in fact, Azerbaijan and the Armenian side wanted a negotiated solution, there have been factors on the table that bring the possibility of consent more likely. For example, for the last 15, 20 years, the Armenian side has been saying Karabakh has never been a part of independent Azerbaijan. It was a part of Soviet Azerbaijan, and yet the current independent Republic of Azerbaijan has negated, rejected its Soviet past, does not consider itself a successor state. So there is a possibility for consent because this was never a part of Azerbaijan to begin with. Or if we're going to talk about the colonial prerequisite, that this is in fact a form of colonialism. It's not what the West was doing in the rest of the world, but it is nevertheless a sort of colonialism within what was the Russian Empire and the Soviet space. Are those sorts of handles, cards, useful in order to get to a place where these minimal requirements that Emil and I are looking for can be met? Professor Stereo?
Sure. So these are, by the way, I think that these are very clever legal arguments, and I applaud you for those. They're excellent arguments.
Does it get me anything?
Yes. Well, so here's the thing on the issue of consent. And what you mentioned how basically Nagorno was never really a part of independent Azerbaijan. The slight problem there is that basically with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia, we saw essentially the international community apply this principle of uti possidetis to these former republics and essentially accept those internal boundaries as new international frontiers that under the principle of uti possidetis cannot be changed through force, right? So that's kind of the difficulty of that argument today. I think that would have been a better argument in 1991 or 1992.
And it was made.
Right, it was made, exactly. But I still think there's something to this argument. On this issue of like sort of pseudo-colonialism, I actually think that might be a better argument to be made, that this idea of external self-determination through remedial secession ought to also apply in these pseudo-colonial situations, where we know that and if you bring like an element of fairness into all of this, if you're trying to construct the remedial secession legal framework and you talk about fairness, good faith, all of those principles, you might say that the fact that Nagorno ended up within Azerbaijan, that was never a fair solution, and that was never the will of the people, or that the populations were forcibly moved around by the Soviet Union. So I think that element of pseudo colonialism, I would go with that argument as the better argument today.
Well, that just brings me back to either our conclusion a few minutes ago about the need for a power backup, or the cynical approach, because that in fact has been the Armenian approach, right? Fairness, justice. I mean, at the end of the day, this is why in the 1960s and 70s, the Armenians of Karabakh began to petition Moscow, precisely because they had issues of fairness and oppression. So at the end of the day, all of these potential mechanisms exist if everyone wants a peaceful solution. But if everyone does not want a peaceful solution, these mechanisms can continue to be ignored, is what I am taking away from this conversation. Emil, am I being too cynical?
It's the power, raw power plays a big role in all of this. I mean, had the United States not gotten involved in Kosovo militarily and caused certain facts on the ground to emerge, we would not have remedial secession that would follow, and the tribunals that followed as well. In this case, this particular conflict in Karabakh has been sort of on much more of an outskirts of European or Western focus, or even Russian focus. So it's been left to its own devices, and we had another emerging regional player, Turkey, sort of come in and insert itself into it. So this aspect of it, I think, is very significant. Certainly, legal arguments are also significant, but legal arguments do need some element of gravity to come to some kind
Political
of fruition.
power to go with it. That's as
and I might say, just on my issue, I mean, as the conflict continues and as bad things happen, I mean, it's a form of what we say lawfare these days, when there are the grievances and the crimes that are committed. That does strengthen the hand of those that want to stop the conflict and hold it in place and stop the offensives, etc. And that's one of the ways that to some extent conduct becomes relevant. And I mean, it's not inappropriate, because the worse it gets, the more it continues, the more people's lives and futures are threatened, the more violence, the more civilians suffer. And you end up in a situation where it becomes even more irreparable. So, I would hope that as we see the civilian suffering, that people don't want to go into this kind of situation where those involved in the conflict might become international pariahs, might be someday subject to prosecution. And the best way to do that is to stop the conflict and resolve it in a fair way, along the kind of formula that Ambassador Mann was talking about.
Well, we had every intention of translating each of these weekly sessions into Armenian. Perhaps we will also translate them into Azerbaijani. I want to thank you all, because at the end of the day, what you're saying is that the tools exist. The legal tools exist. The human rights, international law tools exist. And negotiation techniques and tactics exist. What remains, again, is the political will on all sides, and the calculus be a search for peace rather than victory, which may or may not be lasting. So I want to thank Professor Milena Sterio, Ambassador Stephen Rapp, Ambassador Stephen Mann, and Samvel Mardirosyan, and of course Robert Avedisian at the very top, for sharing this time with us in this 5th week of the series entitled Armenia and Azerbaijan at War. I really don't know where we will go from here. I know that there are so many other real on-the-ground questions to examine, and Emil Sanamyan, who has been a part of these 5 weeks, continues to edit Focus on Karabakh on the Institute's website, which is a mix of documents, analyses, opinion, and now we've added a new section called Voices on Karabakh, asking thinkers from around the world to submit short essays that raise some of the questions that haven't even been touched in these and other conversations. These 5 episodes, 5 weeks, will continue to be available on YouTube, on Facebook, on the Institute's site. They're also available as audio podcasts as part of the Institute's Unpacking Armenian Studies series. Thank you for following, and we need to, all of us as humans, continue to be hopeful and active at the same time. Otherwise, there is no otherwise. Thank you for joining us.